All right. Well, thanks so much for agreeing to sit down with me. I was wondering if just to start, you could like kind of explain like who you are and what your experience has been with music,
Sure.
in the Richmond music scene, and with Gallery 5.
I guess to start, I would start when I came to Richmond was as a freshman in college in 2008, and I was pursuing a music degree in jazz performance for tenor saxophone. And I, as much as I gained out of that first semester and that first year, I felt like I was a little bit too green into like what I wanted to do with my life, and I was partying a little bit too much, and it was hard to find my focus through the music scene and through all the professors I had, and I ended up changing my degree right after that first year, dropping it to a minor and then pursuing psychology. And it actually wasn't until about 2012, as I was near graduating from undergraduate, that I kind of fell back into pursuing music and got deep into jazz, saxophone in different genres, and I was playing with some rock bands and some metal bands and just really exploring that. And it was also around that time, 2012 or 13, that I had a bandmate who was working here booking a lot of the shows at Gallery 5, and I slowly got pulled into the kind of apparatus and this weird nonprofit community art space, booking every possible genre of show, from world music to jazz to classical to metal to burlesque to indie rock, you name it. It felt like Gallery 5 really had no red tape as far as what we were open to exploring. As long as there was an artistic input and an audience to receive that kind of creativity, it felt like that was right for helping host that community. And that was really kind of eye-opening to me. I had been to venues before and I played some shows, but it was typically in much more standardized kind of corporate style venues. So the house show scene in Richmond around that time was also very flourishing, kind of the DIY warehouse and house show scene. And Gallery 5 kind of represented a middle ground of that from my perspective, as far as a lesser barrier of entry where newer musicians and even musicians who are seasoned but maybe choosing their own path. They're not playing covers, they're not even playing genres that are easily defined. They're just kind of creating their own lanes. And sometimes it can be hard to find a home for that kind of art, be it visual or auditory. And I feel like house show scenes, places like Gallery 5, other venues in town that I feel like take a lot of risks, like the Camel over on Broad Street. There's a lot to be offered in a city like Richmond. It's not so big that artists and bands and musicians are lost in the noise of a Brooklyn or a Chicago or an LA, but it is big enough to support a multitude of venues. So I feel like that's why cities Richmond size, you definitely see a lot of artistic growth, and those types of cities can be good incubators for scenes. I'm sorry, I kind of went on a run-on sentence.
No.
But I feel like just kind of painting that picture of how I came to Richmond for music, and then I kind of fell away from it. And I think it's a testament to Richmond's scene and Richmond's artistic history that it kind of pulled me right back into it. And I've kind of been invested in the music scene, helping prop up the music scene, community spaces since.
Nice, yeah, awesome. That's super interesting. Can you speak a little bit to like what you kind of do a lot with Gallery 5 and like what your role is here?
Sure. I mean, I think on paper I'm the operations manager, but I do a lot of the booking. Up until maybe a couple months ago, I was doing all the booking. Since Prabir Mehta's departure from the organization, he's an adjunct at, a previous professor at U of R.
Okay.
And I do a lot of this. I do the staffing. I'm doing a lot of the payroll and financing. I'm wearing a lot of hats, and I think at a nonprofit that becomes kind of normal. But really, I feel like this is the type of organization where it takes a village. And whether you're looking at the staff and myself in a managerial role, or at the board of our nonprofit, which is essentially a bunch of volunteer supervisors who all have their own skill sets, all have their own path through the arts and their own their own value to the organization. And it really just takes this massive team to keep a space like this solvent to any sort of expenditures, while also weighing that and trying to be as good of an incubator for the arts as possible.
Yeah.
It's helpful that there isn't some kingpin owner of the organization that is expecting to rake profits off the top, but it is even still just a challenge to just stay solvent. And by solvent, I just mean being able to pay the band, being able to pay the staff, being able to pay our rent, which is also ever increasing in the city of Richmond. So I think a lot of my job is just kind of wearing all those hats and trying to keep as much of that doom and gloom of the challenges of maintaining a venue out of the audience doesn't need to be thinking about, the band's artists don't need to be thinking about that. It's about how do we create as nice of an ecosystem for arts to incubate and just keep the place open. I feel like my goal of a space like Gallery 5 is to be able to come back here 20, 30 years later and just see that it's still here, to see that Richmond scene is still flourishing.
Yeah, that's great. So like with that rising demand that you kind of mentioned, to like all that stuff you guys have to deal with, like how have you kind of managed to adapt to continue to keep up with that? Have there been any like
it's probably a longer conversation than you're going to fit into your into the abstract of this. But it's a multitude of factors. I think it's a growth as a 20-year, going on 20 years in this coming April. As a 20-year organization, I think it's growing into maturity as far as seeking larger grants, seeking larger sponsorships and individual donations to support either annual programming, monthly programming, individual events, fundraisers. So there's that angle. There's also kind of I think it's I don't know if it's global in the music scene, but it's certainly in America. It's an open secret that the arts and music has been subsidized so heavily by alcohol sales for so many decades. And I think growing trends, healthy trends of crowds moving away from alcohol as a substance of choice is a challenge to a lot of music venues, and especially a lot of smaller venues, where normally the ticket price is mostly going to the immediate overhead and the artists and bands that are playing. And it's mostly alcohol sales that are subsidizing the additional costs of an organization like a Gallery 5 or a Camel or even a Broadberry. They're relying so heavily on the alcohol sales that adapting to these growing trends and revamping non-alcoholic options, providing as many non-alcoholic revenue streams as possible, be it sponsorships, fundraisers, grants, snacks, kombucha, and also just in some cases revisiting door deals, revisiting ticket sales deals with the artists to kind of adapt to the growing trends and changes.
Yeah, great. So you have experience in the Richmond music scene, both as a performer and here at Gallery 5. Has your perspective kind of changed since when you first came as a student? How has your perspective shifted about the music scene throughout your different roles?
That's a hard question to answer because, to speak without bias, I think there's two shifts that happen, and they happen at the same time, which is my own perspective and my own understanding of what I'm looking at and what I'm hearing, and just complete change in the actual reality of things. So, when I was first in Richmond, I was at VCU and I was studying jazz and psychology, and I saw a very small, narrow subsection of Richmond. I didn't know about Gallery 5 until 2012, 7 years into its history. I certainly didn't know a lot about many of the other kind of DIY spaces at that time. So I think there's kind of two shifts that happen as a newcomer to Richmond, which is you opening your vista and kind of being able to see the larger art scene at play. But then there's also just fundamental things that happened between around that time, 2010 to 2024, as far as rising rent costs. I think if we really want to get into it, I think rising rent costs definitely affects the house show scene. Yeah. I think if you're paying $300 for rent and you're able to go in on a house with your friends, it's a little easier to stomach that. If you're paying $1,500 for an apartment, you're taking less risks. Landlords normally are less willing to work with you if you're doing anything like that, hosting art events. So I think the restricting house show scene, the changing economics of venues, again, this is a much larger conversation. I think that I'm not even necessarily educated to speak on, but I think that a lot of the Live Nation and Ticketmaster macroeconomics of the music scene throughout the states has a lot of trickle-down effects on events, on smaller venues.
Yeah.
It gets into BMI and CSAC and ASCAP as well. There's kind of a larger conversation to be had about the way that the music industry operates. And normally when those numbers fall on a spreadsheet that makes sense for the national or a large amphitheater and these Live Nation, and you know what I mean by Live Nation as far as like the large conglomerate of venues and ticketing sites.
Yeah.
The deals that work for them don't often work for the small venues, and the small venues very rarely have a seat at the table when those deals are struck. But the rules as far as music licensing, that a venue has to pay basically royalties to the music licensing guilds like CSAC and ASCAP and BMI, at least are the three that we have contracts with. Those kind of deals can definitely increase the restriction on local venues and how they operate. So I think there's kind of a larger conversation to be had about how local economies work with music, and also just how the larger music industry affects just being a venue in 2024.
Yeah, it's all really interesting stuff. We've talked a little bit about some of that economic side in our class. I was wondering a little bit more just on your personal experiences. Have your experiences as a performing musician affected how you look at your role here?
Oh, yeah.
Or how you perform your role here?
Yeah. Sorry to take that on an economic tangent.
No. I value that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that also speaks to kind of there's a cognitive dissonance or divide in my mind, because on one side, I am, purely a lot of times my band will go and play a show, and we're just happy to, either support a touring act, or we're not thinking about a bottom line at all. Mm-hmm. But then coming from Gallery 5, it's I have to think about the bottom line as well. Yeah. So I think there is a divide between what's good for the. There's often a cognitive dissonance as far as what is good for the arts community and what is sustainable. Right. And things like grants and sponsorships and support from the city and partnerships with larger local businesses as well are ways to kind of merge those two things of what's good for the arts community and also what is sustainable. So you can sometimes strike a balance where there's an overlap. But as far as how my own music, musicianship and experience in playing in bands affects how I try to run Gallery 5, I think it's just never thinking that I'm the tastemaker. I think that's maybe the biggest thing that I play in a weird progressive rock meets noise rock meets jazz kind of instrumental band, and we have a pretty dedicated following, a small but dedicated following in Richmond, and we tour up and down the East Coast. But it's weird, and even bookers we're working with, I'm always just astounded they said yes, because we don't neatly fit into a box. And I have my own personal tastes. I really like jazz. I don't even really like metal all that much. I listen to a lot of jazz and hip hop and some electronic music and soundtracks and video game music. And I think being able to separate what your own personal tastes are from what the scene is leaning towards, and what just always being open to what someone in town or someone locally or touring is offering is a healthy metric. I can't be the judge and executioner of what I think should be happening in this space. Really, if there's a community for it, that's all I need to know. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
no, totally, yeah. That kind of leads in to one of the themes I want to talk about. So I had this quote from Rebecca Duke that said, "It is the social aspect of experiencing, appreciating, and discussing a performance that helps to maintain a scene's vibrancy." So basically, the socialization that surrounds these kind of venues. So I was kind of wondering how you observe socialization working at Gallery 5, and if that plays a role in maybe which groups you want to bring in, people interacting with people. conversing about different performances and kind of forming connections through music. Do you
Oh, sure.
observe that being like an important part of?
It's probably the most important part.
Yeah.
And that's also my biggest advice to new bands. We field thousands of booking emails sometimes a week, and we obviously don't have the space to put them all on. Sometimes we don't even have the capacity to take them all in. However, I think one of my biggest advices to new artists who are in the city is to network. A lot of times venues and small venues of ragtag teams don't really have the capacity to play talent scout and really find the home for this new sound. Mm-hmm. And it is kind of on the artist, unfortunately, to kind of break into that. Go to shows yourself, find music that inspires you, and then bridge that gap and find other musicians who are inspiring you and coalition build. As simply put, that could be that you play with a group of people, and then you have some friends who play with another group of people, and you can build up a showcase or a festival, or sometimes overlap as far as how you're making music. But I think just that aspect of socialization is kind of necessary, because nothing works in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. Yeah, nothing's happening in a vacuum. There's always how you get people to shows is socialization. I think until you reach that level where you are, headlining a large venue and you have this massive apparatus and search term optimization at work, and people are just coming to your show because of your name recognition. Right. Until you reach that point, it really is just you're taking a plunge, and you're just trying to convince your friends and family and strangers in your city to dedicate their Friday or Saturday night or Tuesday night to just also take that plunge and come out and see some music that maybe they're not familiar with.
Yeah.
It's kind of a hard sell sometimes,
mm-hmm.
And I mean, we live in 2024. There's a million distractions, there's a million things to do. So I think that coalition. Socialization is one way to put it, but I like to think of it as like coalition building. Building strong ties in your community, and that can be social ties that are just mutually beneficial and supporting each other.
Yeah, that's interesting. Coalition building. So that ends like what role do you see Gallery 5 serving, like in the dynamic of the music scene in Richmond? I know you mentioned it was sort of a middle ground between the house shows and.
I think we're more I've always looked at us as the middle ground. I think we do operate fairly, similar to like other community art spaces. Mm-hmm. There's a few it's rare to find a space just like Gallery 5, but I've encountered a few on the road in other states. But I do think that Gallery 5 has a unique role of, we're not a restaurant, we're just a venue and a bar, which is a rarity in the state of Virginia. And we also can only really we can only make sales or invite people in here if we have an event, if we have an artistic event. So that behooves us to open ourselves to as many different communities as possible. I think there are other venues that are doing that in a unique way. Like I've referenced the Camel before in this conversation, but I think the Camel is a great example of a venue that is really healthy for the scene, because they're having Magic the Gathering nights, and they're having metal, and they're having drag and indie rock, and I think sometimes they have 33 events a month. It's insane the amount that they're able to accomplish, and it's something that Gallery 5 is also striving for, is just being that home to as many different local music scenes, as many different local nonprofits that might need a home, whether that's for a meeting or a benefit, a fundraiser. So it's really just being a nexus for a lot of cool things to happen. I think that we always still have our uphill battles as far as staying solvent as an organization, and making sure that we can sustain ourselves into the future. But I think that the end goal of Gallery 5 is to kind of just be able to support the community in a way that for-profit businesses just can't quite commit to.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's interesting you mentioned like you don't serve any food or anything. We had just talked earlier today in our class a little bit about like some of the laws in Virginia and how Like there aren't really any traditional bars that like only
Yeah.
serve hard liquor. So how is Gallery 5 able to? Because my understanding was that you had to serve food
Yeah,
in order
no,
to have
it's
a bar, but
it's a specificity of our ABC license that I can't speak on the genesis of. I think it was a lot of back in 2006 or 7, I believe, maybe 7 or 8, is when we acquired this kind of niche license with the state of Virginia, and it's essentially a performing arts license.
yeah,
They've changed the lexicon, the name of it, a few times over the years, but it's essentially a performing arts facility license, and it is extremely hard to get.
right.
And it's only offered to 501c3s, and there's a bunch of other stipulations. But essentially, yeah, we are able to host events, and when we host events, when and only when we host events, we can also sell alcohol under that license, and only on the premises.
So because it's a nonprofit and performing, okay.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah. It's kind of there's a few steps. The most important is of being a 501c3.
Yeah.
Or it might also be applicable to 501c3s or 501c4s. But you'd have to speak to my ABC agent about the intricacies of exactly what what other venues or organizations would be applicable.
So another thing I kind of wanted to touch on in this conversation was, there's a lot of conversation about how like different venues can reflect like different demographics, and different musicians and different artists and stuff can also reflect different demographic groups. So would you say that there is any sort of defined like demographic of Gallery 5, or does it kind of change with the artists?
I don't. It's hard to answer this question without feeling like I'm biased.
Right, and if you don't really have an answer, that's okay.
No, I certainly have an answer, but the disclaimer is that I don't want to speak too boldly, but I feel like Gallery 5 has an incredibly unique demographic in that we aren't a bar,
right?
Really,
right.
we are a bar, but we're only a bar when we have an event, and because we're not a bar and we're not a restaurant, we don't really have the same style of like regulars that I feel like a lot of other venues might have, and therefore, if you took a sample of our of the demographic during a burlesque event versus an indie rock show the next night versus a listening room the following night versus a karaoke on the following Tuesday versus a noise rock or harsh noise show that happens on a Wednesday, those in a lot of cases those might be completely unique demographics with maybe only a few individuals overlapping.
Yeah.
And I think I'm sure there are other, I don't want to be too biased, I'm sure there are other venues in town that also are achieving that kind of extremely diverse demographic from night to night. But I think Gallery 5 is certainly one of them. And it's something that a lot of our staff enjoy too. A lot of the engineers, the sound engineers, the bartenders, our security, our hosts who work here. I want to believe, we should probably poll them first before I speak for them. But I want to believe that's one of the biggest perks of working in a space like Gallery 5, is that it's hard to get bored. Because you're always even if it's the same style of music a month later, it's kind of always a unique thing. Even from the engineer's perspective, if they're working 3 shifts in 1 week at Gallery 5, it could be a burlesque event, a noise rock show, and a jazz event, and it's just completely different demographics, completely different sounds, and visuals as well.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting question, but also something that we strive for, is just trying to not put ourselves in a box. And just as a footnote to that question, I think it is interesting that something as we have matured as an organization, and our board members have been working diligently to seek grants and ways to sustain us, it's something that we've actually struggled with, and I think are finally kind of overcoming. Is a lot of times when talking with larger grant organizations and sponsorship organizations, a lot of them want a very clear, simple answer. Right? What do you do here at Gallery 5? And it would be a lot easier if we said we're a jazz band. But it's a harder pitch to say, well, we do all of these things every month throughout the year. And it's been a hard pitch to kind of nail down exactly what. There's too many adjectives. There's too many ways to describe all the various communities that we're working with, all the various other local nonprofits we're working with. So it's something that we definitely have strived for, even to our own detriment, is to have as diverse of a demographic and really just be an unbiased nexus for different communities.
Yeah, so it seems like you've been able to draw from a lot of different demographics because of like the variety of music that's coming in and different events.
Yeah.
Would you say that that's like applicable to a lot of venues in this area?
That's why I had the disclaimer in the beginning. I've seen both sides of that. Bring up the Camel again. I think the Camel does a good job of pulling from diverse communities. They do have more of a regular crowd because they've been there serving food and more consistently hosting shows. So I think there's probably a pretty regular crowd as well. But I think they do a good job of accessing various demographics. I've also seen the other side of it where some venues, not to their own detriment, but I think like Fuzzy Cactus is a good example, that it's one of the only venues on North Side. And they have some really cool shows over there. But they're also pulling more of a regular crowd. It's kind of like the people in North Side just kind of gravitate to that venue. Because it's a really cool space over there. And because of that, I think they have like a little bit less of a turnover. Maybe not going outside of their norm as much. But a lot of it is there's nothing wrong with that. I've played venues where all they do is folk, and they do it really well. I've been to venues that they only do jazz, but they're the best jazz venue in the city. So I don't think there's necessarily anything. It's hard to say that one approach is better or worse. I think where I stand is that it's important to have both. I think it's important to have jazz venues that are just jazz venues, hip-hop spaces that are just hip-hop spaces, and I think it's also important to have kind of community centers that are bringing in multiple scenes, because it's in those kind of it's in venues like the Camel or Gallery 5 that I think you coalition build the best. If you're only interacting with people who are in your own music scene and your own genre and adjacent to your genre, I think it's harder to build stronger communities and stronger scenes that are diverse. So some of my favorite shows that we put on here that I've been to elsewhere in the city are what we kind of call genre mash or genre blender shows, which is a noise rock showcase leading into a indie rock band and then a hip hop act and then a metal band. You get a lot of different people in one room on that night, and in a lot of cases there's a guarantee that some of those people in that room are hearing a genre for the first time, or at least in recent times. So I think that's an important thing to have in the scene.
Yeah. So you kind of mentioned earlier that you work with some other nonprofits in the area. Could you speak a little bit to this and if this is part of the coalition building that you were talking about?
I mean, I think it's an inevitable kind of. It's a necessity. It's just it's something that happens naturally, even if whether or not we're striving for it. But Gallery 5 and WRAR have always had a long-standing partnership. We were also founded around the same time. And Gallery 5 and Classical Revolution, which is a smaller nonprofit kind of group of classical artists, an offshoot of the Richmond Symphony, to misquote or paraphrase their mission statement, it's to bring classical music out of the concert halls into bars, coffee shops, and kind of being that organization attempts to be an ambassador of classical arts and classical music and bringing it into spaces that you wouldn't otherwise hear it. And we've been working with Classical Rev for the last 2 or 3 years since COVID. And building up, we have a benefit next month for Richmond Reproductive Freedom Project. We have, I think it's mostly just about being open to, flexing and becoming a meeting space for other nonprofits as well. We hosted WRAR's annual fundraiser back in October, right before Halloween. It was amazing. It was also a good example of one of those genre blender shows where it was a very diverse crowd of hip-hop lovers, and there was an Oasis band that closed out the night. It was really weird. It was weird in the best ways,
So you mentioned the reproductive freedom. Is that like a frequent thing that you guys try to work on? Is like these
Yeah.
other sorts of goals?
It's
outside of
something.
music?
It's we're never trying to pressure any nonprofits or other local organizations into benefits. But I do think that it's just something that when we can do it, we're always
Right.
excited to do it.
Yeah.
It's often mutually beneficial.
Yeah.
It's one of those examples where it's like great. We can raise money for a good cause, and we can also just curate a good show with a good turnout because people want to come out and support a good cause. So
Yeah.
so I mean it tends to be a net positive every time we do something like that.
Yeah.
A lot of the challenge of those nights is just finding them, building them, making sure they're not competing with each other. You don't want multiple benefit shows on one night across the city. So
Yeah.
there's definitely some kind of backroom communications that are whether they're necessary or not. I think it's helpful to have a line between the different venues and the different bookers in town, so that there's there's one side of the conversation which is everybody's just trying to sustain and exist, but there's also just how do we continue to build a strong music scene, something that's not as fragile and not as vulnerable to the mechanisms of the live nations of the world.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean that's really interesting. There seems to be like a real musical network. So you kind of a little bit touched on this already with you in 30 years you just want to see if this place is still standing.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if there are any like more goals you have for the future of Gallery 5, like how you want to see this space impacting people in the near future, maybe the next 10 years.
Yeah. It's hard to look too far out when we're just looking week to week in a lot of cases, week to week, month to month. Looking at next year. We've actually I know it's your first time in the space, so most of this might be lost on the, as far as your perspective of Gallery 5, but we actually just went through a massive change over the last 5 years as far as having to close for an entire year over COVID. Our stage used to be kind of in the location you're seeing it now.
Yeah.
And during COVID, or when we were reopening, I think we were looking to reopen in January of 2021. And we eventually opened in February, I think on Valentine's Day of 2021, after about a year of being closed. And to kind of adhere to a lot of the social distancing laws and the government mandates as far as airflow in the space, we actually had to move our stage entirely. And it was living in the center of the room for the last probably 2 or 3 years, so that we can open the large firehouse doors that you can't see right now behind the stage. And it was nice. It was an interesting change. It wasn't ever very, the feng shui of the room always felt off since we did that, because it was kind of weird. We had the stage in the center of the room, and the sound wasn't great. It was hard to work with. And we just back in August toiled away, fundraised, and were able to kind of put it back into place and upgrade it with full truss and new equipment. So I would say it's like we're kind of in a place now where we're, I think, sounding better as a venue, looking better as a venue, and a lot of our current goals are short term. We're not looking 5-10 years in the future right now, but we are just trying to continually improve kind of the mechanisms of Gallery 5 and how we are able to provide the best space possible.
Yeah.
To bands, to theatrical producers, to burlesque, to fundraisers, to our staff, to our contractors, our engineers. I think it is hard to look at 5 years in advance and not really know how the city will change.
Right. Yeah.
You can ask that question again. I'll probably come up with a different answer. But I think that our goal is just to figure out how to sustain ourselves.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense.
In capitalism, without being too capitalistic, with how we, are, aiming to provide the best equitable possible model for musicians and for artists.
Yeah.
Because another whole half of us outside of music is we are an art gallery as well.
Oh,
so
yeah.
we're working with visual arts and musical arts, and and communities in between. So I think it is kind of it's a difficult question to answer as far as where we're going to be in 5 years.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll be 25 years old. That's all. That's all I can say.
That totally tracks. That sounds super tough. Having to be closed for a whole year for COVID. I mean,
COVID was rough. Yeah.
If you're able to speak a little bit to like how that affected people.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
I think, I mean, it affected, we are a organization, not to say that any for-profit businesses didn't suffer over COVID, because they certainly did. It was, you know, it was tragic nationwide. But I think an organization like Gallery 5 was hit especially hard because we are an organization that is propped up by a lot of volunteer work, a lot of part-time work, a lot of contracting work, and because there aren't a lot of full-time positions, when something like COVID happens, it's a lot more work to kind of. I wasn't sure of the economics at the time, but I imagine it was difficult to seek certain PPP loans that were probably offered to other for-profits that can, prove more full-time labor. And it's also just hard. It's more herding cats to get once we're reopening to get everybody back in the room together, because in a lot of cases it was part-time. You have part-time bartenders and you have sound contractors who are working at other venues, and trying to get the team back together can take a little bit of work. And I think we're in a great place right now, but that was definitely an added challenge outside of just paying our exorbitant rent every month while we were closed.
Right. Yeah.
I think just being closed for a year with no potential revenue streams was probably the most challenging part of COVID.
Yeah. And
that's probably true for most businesses.
Yeah. Would you say that Gallery 5 has been able to now at this point bounce back, or are we still kind of feeling the?
No. I mean, I think one of our board members put it best in that we're walking towards the clearing, and hey, Matt. I think that there's still work to be done, but and not to be too hopeful, but I think we're definitely heading in the best direction we have been.
Yeah.
At least in my tenure here.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. I was totally unaware that there was also an art gallery aspect to this.
Actually, and we flip the art gallery every single month. We work with recently it's mostly been local artists, or at least regional artists.
Yeah.
The current one, I can flip the lights on after we end this meeting.
Yeah.
It's actually a friend of mine curated with 25 different resin cast and vinyl toy. He doesn't like the word toy, but Japanese style figurines and models.
That's interesting.
So it's an interesting. We've never done anything quite like this as far as like a kaiju model. I mean, I think the figures would speak for themselves. I'm struggling with defining it. But I know in December we're having our annual Krampusnacht, which is kind of like an evil Christmas, evil Santa Claus exhibit.
Yeah.
That is curated by a few artists every year. That it's really breathtaking. There's a lot of masked work. There's a lot of oil on canvas. Each month, it really is such a wildly different exhibit. And Amanda Robinson, who's actually the founder of Gallery 5, and stepped away for about 10 years, but she's been back the last year and a half to 2 years. And she comes from a visual art background as well. And she's really been helping us kind of re-find our footing as far as the visual art side of the space, and maintaining a lot of that community on that side of the fence as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I've never really been to a venue that had that other aspect to it. But do you see that kind of playing into the interplay of the coalition building, and the interplay with the music?
100%. Yeah.
Do you think the visual art is an important part of that?
Yeah, well, I think that it doesn't even cover all the bases, but I think that having a venue that's not specifically one medium of art, music, or visual art,
right,
is naturally going to help coalition building.
Yeah.
Because there's no one way to approach the art, whether that's dance, and I would include like burlesque and drag, and we have like more modern dance here. It's something that we've been trying to break into a little bit more. We probably have the least experience doing things like modern dance, as far as like interpretive movement.
Yeah.
But I think all of those things are just how people are, coping with their daily life and expressing themselves creatively. I think that it's important to, offer a space that can provide a space that can incubate all of those forms of art. Yeah. And ideally merging them all into not the same event, but merging them into the same conversation about. There's no one way, there's no one genre, there's no one instrument, there's no one one approach that's correct or incorrect. It's just about having spaces to do so.
Yeah, that's great. I was to ask. I was kind of wondering, if you could, do whatever, wave magic wands, what would you want to see changed about the Richmond music scene? Is there anything that you think could be improved upon?
Yeah, I'm sure there's things that could be improved upon, but I'd be foolish to say that I know the answer.
Okay.
I think that there's there's a few ways to approach that. I think that there's a growing disconnect between how expensive it is to put on a show,
right, and
audience's aversion to any ticket price that's over $10. Most of our events are $10 to $15 in price for a venue this size, and that tends to be the norm around the city. And I think there is a disconnect between cost of labor, cost of rent, cost of operations, inflation of product, inflation of any sort of amenities, with that static price tag. Yeah. It makes me think to, there's even probably 10, 15 years ago, it was still $10. So kind of just even looking at the inflationary principles of what $10 got you, a decade ago as to what it gets you now. I think that's something that I don't know how to. If I were really looking for inspiration, I'd probably be looking towards Europe and parts of. I have a little bit of knowledge of France and how they subsidize their arts on a state level. Yeah. And venues, as long as they're adhering to certain principles that the state authorized, are actually subsidized in some means, so that amenities and for touring artists, for local artists, for shows are actually being funded by the taxpayers in some capacity. I don't know if that ever fly in the state. And the workaround is through grants, is through corporate sponsorships. You see it in the example of the Altria, being the landmark theaters, the Altria Theater, center stages, the Dominion Center. So corporate sponsorships on the for-profit side, and then grants on the local and nonprofit side seems to be the answer. Yeah. But I do think that there are smaller venues and smaller business owners that are just standalone, and being for-profit by a model, they're maybe not offered any sort of subsidies or any sort of pathways outside of just the economics of just running a restaurant, which, whether it's a music venue or a restaurant, it's a provably low margin as far as your ability for profit over your expenses. Restaurants more so than others.
Awesome. Well, is there anything else that we didn't cover that you wanted to speak on?
No, probably not.
All right. Awesome.
Feel free to reach out to me though if you listen back through this and you have any follow-up questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
It's been super helpful.
Yeah.